So now we go deep inside in the clinical practice, but I will take the opportunity of the nice talk by Robert to come back to some very simple concept, because basically Poseidon is a simple classification system, nothing new. It was just a way to systemize something that was present in a very simple way. I have another very difficult question for you about the capital of Italy. Probably, I don't know. No, let's go to science. Are you ready? Because I like to start with a question, because it's very important for me understanding what is your perception of this classification system. So we have one question. What is in your mind Poseidon classification? First option, Poseidon represents a valid alternative to Bologna criteria for classification of a poor ovarian response. Second, Poseidon identifies 4 groups of low prognosis women who are homogeneous with respect to the general population in terms of prognosis. 3, Poseidon identifies 4 groups of low prognosis women which differ each other's in terms of prognosis, with the differences across the single groups in Poseidon. And 4, Poseidon represents all the above. You can vote. No music, Alessandro? So I'm very happy when there are differences in answer, because it means that the interpretation is different. The dominant seems to be 4 groups of low prognosis patients with differences across the Poseidon groups and subgroups. And so we will talk about it, and thank you very much for your opinion. So in this talk, I will try to directly focus on Poseidon groups 1 and 2 that are strictly related to the idea of hypo response to exogenous gonotrophins. In the second round, I will comment some available data from clinical trials of concerning specific treatments that had been adopted in patients selected as Poseidon 1 and 2. And this is my history, and I will also provide you some information about how to use LH in this patient, not because I want to talk about LH, but because I think it's paradigmatic of the difference between Bologna and Poseidon criteria. So let's move to the first point. So I said Poseidon is very easy. Why? Because consider all the variables that are implicated in defining the prognosis of patients. The first variables are related to quantity and are the same that had been adopted by Bologna criteria. So the number of sites, because it's very important, the number of sites for defining prognosis of patients, and the number and the ovarian reserve, that in terms of quantity is usually measured by anti-Mullerian hormone or antral follicle count. So what's new in Poseidon? That 2 variables, 2 features, 2 concepts have been introduced. The concept of ovarian sensitivity and the concept of age-related euploidy rates that is representative, in my opinion, of ovarian quality. So if you remember, Bologna criteria just defined 40 years of age as cutoff for prognosis. In Poseidon, any single age above 35 years is associated with a different rate in aneuploidies and euploidies. And so we have to consider that we have to personalize, we have to take in consideration the expected rate of euploidies for understanding which is the ideal number of oocyte for a given patient. What about ovarian sensitivity? Because this is, let me tell you, the real reason why Poseidon was originally conceived. Because before Poseidon, we only focused on the number of eggs, but we didn't focus on the number of eggs is or not consistent with the ovarian reserve of the patient. If you have a look, the group 1 and 2 are patients that had an ovarian response lower than expected. Patients starting with good prognosis, good ovarian reserve, that at the end of the stimulation had less oocytes than expected. We can say suboptimal, between 5 and 9. We can say poor, below 4. But the concept in Poseidon groups 1 and 2 is that those patients had less oocytes than expected, which is the difference with the group 3 and 4, where the low number of oocytes was expected because of low ovarian reserve. So focusing on groups 1 and 2, we can say that this patient have hyposensitivity to gonotrophins. And hyposensitivity gave the concept of hyporesponder that is totally different from the concept of poor response in general. So to go into practice, Robert mentioned two indicators of ovarian sensitivity, FORT and FOI. So what do they have in common? In both cases, we have the same denominator, which is the starting point at the beginning of stimulation, the antral follicle count, the number of follicles between 2 and 9 millimeters. In the case of FORT, follicle output rate, as a numerator, we have the number or the percentage of these follicles reaching maturity. In the case of FOI, at the numerator, we have the number of eggs collected. So the starting point and the end of the stimulation define the sensitivity that the ovary had to a given stimulation. To move it in a clinical practice, I think that this concept is clear, but I think that repeating can be helpful for every one of us. We have this case that, in my opinion, is very intriguing. We have a patient with a very good antral follicle count, probably 10, 15 antral follicles. At the end of the stimulation, vast majority of follicles remain below 10 millimeters, was not recruited, and only 4 dominant follicles were at the end. So at the end of the stimulation, this patient had only 3-4 oocytes. So in this case, the denominator was very huge, but the numerator, at the end of the stimulation, in terms of FORT and FOI, were very low. This is a second case where we can say that we have the same result: 3 oocyte, 4 follicles reaching maturity, but this patient at the beginning of the stimulation had only 4 antral follicles. So at the end of the day, we can say that 4 is 4. Both patients had the same number of follicles overcoming 16 millimeters. But the starting point of these two patients was totally different. We can say that the prognosis will be probably the same, because prognosis is related to the number of eggs. So if the patients are similar in terms of age, probably BMI, probably they will have the same prognosis, because prognosis is defined by the number of eggs and the rate of aneuploidies expected per age. But the difference is that in the first patient who had less follicles and less oocytes than expected, we can change something in second stimulation. We can increase the dose, we can change gonotrophins, we can employ the maximum of her potential. In the other patient, the ovarian sensitivity was very good. She started with 4 antral follicles, she had 4 oocytes. So the ovary responded perfectly. because the sensitivity was very good. But she couldn't have more oocyte than the initial antral follicle. That's the difference. So it's strange in our mindset to think that a patient with 4 eggs is a normal responder. But if the patient moved from 4 antral follicles and has 4 eggs, the ovarian response was good. The problem was the ovarian reserve, which is a different concept. This is new mindset, the concept, because I think that it can be useful in a clinical practice. This is something that we did, and I have to thank Alberto here for this initiative, that he believed so much in this and coordinated inside our Italian society. This initiative, we tried to propose a marker of the FOI and also the FORT of ovarian sensitivity also as a key performance indicator. Because if you analyze your data every second month, every month, every 3 months, is important, because if you see the previous system in classifying key performance indicator were focused only on the number of eggs, mature eggs, live birth rate, or embryologic parameters. But we need to measure the quality of our stimulation process as the key performance indicators. We need a key performance indicator. And we think that FORT and FOI can be very useful, because if at the end of the month you have in your unit you have a trend with a low FORT and FOI, it means that probably you have an impaired follicular growth and you have to revise your stimulation. But if you have a normal FORT, meaning that during stimulation you have a good follicle recruitment but low FOI, probably you have to revise. In our unit, we have to revise triggering or egg collection activities. So I think that monitoring FORT and FOI is very useful in the clinical practice in terms of total quality management for understanding how your team, our team, is working in a given window of time. So let's go rapidly to the second part of my talk. And I like, obviously, and this is my disclosure, we like Poseidon, but the question is how the scientific community follows Poseidon, how many trials we have, and what's going on in terms of clinical practice and research in this. And I would like to describe some data concerning how Poseidon has been validated in some trials and some attempts of clinical trials in low prognosis patients classified as Poseidon groups. So I take the opportunity to thank Akan and Sandro Esteves, because they, together with Professor Wong from Vietnam, they established an incredible network, intercontinental network, with centers with a huge number of cycles per year. And they tried to have a real-world evidence information about patients classified according to Poseidon system. And it was amazing. We are talking about 13,000 patients analyzed. So the sample size is huge. You can see that in this center, the Poseidon patients, meaning low prognosis patients, are above 50% of treated patients. And what is amazing is that group 1 and group 2 represent the vast majority of these patients. This is important if we talk about Bologna and Poseidon, because patients belonging to group 1 and 2 that are low prognosis patients were totally not evaluated in the previous classification system. So in the previous classification system, only the top of the iceberg, meaning patients with a low number of sites and above 40 years of age, were classified. But an intermediate window of patients with a lower prognosis was not identified and not treated with different approaches in the clinical practice. So this is another nice real-life evidence, and this is, I think, the most important point and I think success in Poseidon. Here we have 9,000 cycles analyzed. And as you can see, group 1, 3, 2, 4, the 4 Poseidon groups have different prognosis if compared each other. So they are homogeneous groups of low prognosis patients. So if you go to Bologna criteria, in Bologna criteria, poor responders have same prognosis, but it is difficult to distinguish the different combinations of variables. Here you have 4 groups that are homogeneous inside and different when compared each other. This is very important because it means, this is just to show you 1 second, that even in subgroups, some differences were found, even when group 1 and group 2 patients were classified in group 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, even subgroups showed differences in terms of live birth rate. So if you have, let's go to the practice. If you have to design a trial, you can take one group with patients that are homogeneous, probably in terms not only of prognosis, but also in terms of pathogenesis, and you can focus your randomized control trial in this patient and adapt the result to a given profile of low prognosis patient. I think that is very important. That's the reason why the group proposed, I don't want to comment all the steps, but differentiated treatments have been hypothesized and proposed for designing in the future clinical trials. And we do hope, Chris, in help of a center like yours that has so incredible number of treatment and quality, because I think that we need a perspective validation of this treatment. At the moment, I have to recognize that we have so many trials in patient classified as Poseidon, but vast majority of this trial are observational, case control, retrospective analysis. So I think that word is changing. I don't think that, this is my opinion, obviously, that the future will be randomized control trials. So probably the fact that we don't have so many randomized control trials in Poseidon also reflects a change, a dramatic change in the way we are using to do clinical research, because now I think that in the era of artificial intelligence, big data analysis, real world analysis in the future can be probably more informative than randomized control trials, but we don't know it. Let me tell you just this. This is a randomized control trial that had been performed in general population to understand if treating a patient with the conventional starting dose in one group, 150 of recombinant FSH, or increasing FSH dose in patients according to antral follicle count gives a difference. So the trial was not designed for Poseidon patient. So one group starting fixed dose, another group starting dose adapted, like the Optimist trial for understanding. But what is amazing is that when they analyze data and they classified low prognosis patients according to Poseidon classification, they realized that patient classified as group 1 and group 2, they observed that in Poseidon group 1 and 2, poor response was significantly lower, while the number of sites was higher in the group that increased in the starting dose. It seems to be obvious, but this is a trial demonstrating what I said before, that if you have a patient that in a previous cycle had less oocytes than expected, in a second cycle, increasing the starting dose can increase, you can exploit, you can use better the potential of the patients. I'm not sure, it is not reported in this trial, not sure that pushing the system and giving a very high doses of gonadotropins can resolve the situation of a patient belonging to group 3 and 4. Because when your ovarian reserve is very low, is not increasing the gonadotropin dose but probably proceeding to duostem accumulation that can change the prognosis. This is another trial, a retrospective analysis that selected patients as group 1 and 2, comparing GnRH antagonist classical protocol with long agonist protocol associated with chorefolitropin and HMG. So patients selected as a POSEIDON 1 and 2, two comparative protocols, and at the end of the day, the authors found that the number of sites, the clinical pregnancy rate, and live birth rate were similar in the two groups, providing evidence that when patients belong to group 1 and 2 POSEIDON, both obviously is a small trial, but I reported this trial just to give you the idea that worldwide people are starting to compare protocols, selecting specific subgroups of low prognosis patients according to POSEIDON criteria. I selected also this because this is another trial performed in groups 1 and 2, and in this case, a flexible standard antagonist protocol was compared with progestin prime domain stimulation with PPOS. Also in this case, no difference was found between the two kinds of approach, but in my opinion, it's intriguing that when patients were stratified in POSEIDON group 1 and POSEIDON group 2, some difference was there, because in POSEIDON group 2, the number of available embryos was higher in the PPOS. And if you have a look to the numbers, you can see that there is a nice trend. Also is a trend, small sample size, but also in cumulative live birth rate. This is 0.09. And this is intriguing because it means that younger systems are more able to adapt. So no difference emerges between the two groups. But when patients with hyper response in the previous cycle are above 35, changing the protocol in terms of premature luteinization prevention, pituitary suppression, can change something probably in the prognosis. So what I want to tell you here, the take-home message, is not the trial per se, but is the idea that selecting patient in group 1 and 2, you can find the differences. And this is something that you cannot see if you just classify patients as poor responders in general. And this is also nice because I want to report this. Here also stratification in POSEIDON 1, 2, 3, and 4 is reported, but I don't mention it. But this is nice. These authors propose two kinds of PPOS. Conventional, meaning that they start medroxyprogesterone acetate from the first day of gonadotrophins, or flexible. They use PPOS as antagonists. They start progesterone on the day where a dominant follicle is there. And they didn't find differences, obviously, in terms of cumulative live birth rate, but they found some difference in FOI. So this is an example of how FOI can be used in clinical trials for understanding. The concept here is, in this trial, a parameter of ovarian sensitivity has been adopted for understanding if a difference is there comparing two protocols. Last 2 minutes, I promise, and I want to give just the idea of the history of providing LH activity in patients with poor prognosis. This is just an example of difference between Bologna and POSEIDON. When recombinant LH was studied for understanding if it can improve the prognosis in poor responder, the first attempt was made with the Bologna criteria. This is the historical ESPART trial. And so here the endpoint was the number of eggs. Patients were selected according to Bologna criteria, and patients were randomized to receive only FSH or a combination of recombinant FSH plus recombinant LH. At the end of the day, no difference was there in terms of number of eggs. But let me tell you, using Bologna criteria, in these trials, a huge percentage of patients were above 40 and with very low ovarian reserve. So I think that when the rate of aneuploidies is above 80%, and the number of eggs collected is 2, 3, which kind of gonotrophin can change prognosis? I think that miracles are not possible in this, at least from doctors. And so I think that the population was not the right one for testing because only worse prognosis patients were included in the trial. We tried inside the POSEIDON group, we established a focus, a special interest group on LH, and we tried to categorize patient studies in a different way. So from one side, we put studies that had been performed in Bologna classical criteria. And from another side, we put studies where the recombinant LH was given in patients with a normal ovarian reserve that during stimulation had an ovarian response to FSH lower than expected. So these are patients that started with FSH, patients with normal antral follicle count, but patients that in the middle of stimulation had no follicles growing. And so these patients the doctor shift to adding recombinant LH or increasing the FSH dose. And so we had 4 trials that had been performed in this way. We called, in this case, hyper-responders, but this is only prospective, I cannot say, identification of patients perfectly consistent with the group 1 and 2 POSEIDON, meaning patients with normal ovarian reserve not responding to a given gonotrophin. And if we categorize study in this way, so Bologna from one side, but hyper-responders consistent with group 1 and 2 POSEIDON to the other side, you can see that the I-square is here not so low, meaning that there is some heterogeneity among studies. But if you have looked to the trend, the general trend, you can see that there is a high number of oocytes retrieved and higher implantation and even clinical pregnancy rate. In here, the I-square is very low, meaning that the results are very homogeneous in patients treated with recombinant LH. So what does it mean? Obviously, we are. I don't think that meta-analysis can have to be always utilized, and in this case, the sample size is very low. I think that meta-analysis are just sometimes an opportunity for understanding if we are on the right track and for giving suggestion for next trials and give direction of research. But this is just to give you an idea that if we talk about poor responders, we use Bologna criteria. Probably we mix apples and oranges. We put in the same basket very heterogeneous patients. But if we classify homogeneous group and we treat patients of a given group, probably because in this case we have low prognosis patients, but we have patients where the number of eggs is still good, the euploidy rate is still acceptable, and so probably giving some difference activity, in this case LH activity, can improve something, and you can see would get this improvement. So I think that the track of research with LH in the future should go in this way. And just to conclude, I want to tell you that I really thank the Bologna criteria because it seems that I don't like it. It was the first historical successful attempt for finding an agreement in a community. Before Bologna criteria, we had 40 different definitions of poor ovarian response. And for the first time in Bologna criteria, an agreement was there, and the antral follicle count and anti-Mullerian hormone were considered in defining poor response. So they are a milestone, but obviously when you have a good starting point, so we can say that Bologna criteria are the antral follicle count, and Poseidon probably is the number of eggs collected. So meaning that is the evolution. So I take the opportunity for thanking all the people involved in Poseidon and people working in my unit. So thank you very much for your attention.